good morning, everyone, and welcome to this panel on democratic institutions, the pillar of North America's prosperity. My name is Ryan Berg. I'm the director of the Americas program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Thanks for joining us today again for this conversation. Before we formally begin, I want to take a moment to thank the U.S.-Mexico Foundation and our co-sponsor on this panel, the International Republican Institute, for their assistance and support throughout the process of organizing this panel. Democracy, as enshrined in the Inter-American Democratic Charter, is the only form of government acceptable to the peoples of the Americas. For North America in particular, the United States, Mexico, and Canada, we're joined together not only by the rich trade flows across our borders, but our robust democratic institutions. Shared democratic values are a key ingredient that allows like-minded countries to agree upon terms of engagement and negotiate productively. Within North America, democratic institutions provide citizens with the tools to advocate for policies that increase prosperity and human welfare. They also create valuable checks on the accumulation of power that prevent monopolistic environments. However, the values that undergird North America's economic engine have come under attack in recent years. No place on the continent has been spared. Growing disinformation, coupled with an increasingly polarized political context, have proven an especially corrosive combination. These challenges existed long before 2020. However, I think it's safe to say that the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated many of their worst elements. For North America to recover and increase economic prosperity for all, it is more important than ever that we double down on democracy. Failing to do so risks the future of the North American economy, as well as the internal stability and prosperity of all three countries. And so to help us think through this nexus between democratic institutions and economic growth, we're fortunate enough today to have a truly superlative panel. And I'll introduce our speakers today before I open it up to them for some brief opening remarks. Our first speaker is Kimberly Breier, former Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs and a policy and intelligence professional with more than 20 years of experience on Western Hemisphere affairs. Our second speaker is Dr. Antonio Garrastazu, Regional Director for Latin America and the Caribbean at the International Republican Institute. Our next speaker will be Antonio Ortiz Mena, Senior Vice President at the Albright Stonebridge Group. And prior to joining ASG, Dr. Ortiz Mena served for 8 years as the Head of Economic Affairs at the Embassy of Mexico in the United States. And our final speaker is Paula Ordorica, a journalist based in Mexico City, specializing in domestic and international politics. Many of you likely know her. She's the host of the TV program A las Tres on Foro TV and is a regular columnist for the newspaper El Universal. And so I want to give a chance to each one of our panelists to make a very brief set of opening remarks. And by brief, I mean about 3 minutes or so. And if you could, in your opening remarks, address what you think the nexus is between democracy and North America's economic vitality. So first over to you, Assistant Secretary Breier.
¿Sí? ¿No? ¿No? Yeah, ahora sí? Ahora sí. Okay. Thank you. I think my instruction is in English, I guess. So thank you, Ryan, and thanks to IRI and CSIS institutions that I am deeply familiar with. I think they're part of our institutions in the North American and regional context. And also to the U.S.-Mexico Foundation, which has really just pulled off something extraordinary with this set of meetings. I actually started my career working on North America 20 years. So to be back in this North American conversation is really, really exciting for me, and I'm pleased to be here. So in thinking about sort of, what are we going to talk about today in terms of the nexus and the important institutions, the analyst in me prevailed as I was thinking about this panel, and I went and started thinking, okay, how do we define the term institution in the North American context, and what are they? I won't go into a lot of detail, but I'll just say, we are in North America, our three countries, very different from the European Union in the sense that we haven't created a lot of supranational institutions. But we do have, as three sovereign countries, a lot of institutional relationships. And I think of it also, we also tend to go, and especially me because I've served in government many times, I go to government, especially federal government a lot of the time, But when we're talking about institutions in North America, I think the conversation is much wider than that. It's a conversation about USMCA, I think, is a key institution in our relationship. I think the private sector is a key institution in our relationship. NGOs, civil society, border communities, governors, mayors along the border, our population. So I think you have to have a broad definition of what it is that we're talking about, because really that defines the norms of how we interact with each other and what we do every day. And I will, saying that I think it's broader than government, I will talk about government because that is where my experience has lied, and it answers Ryan's question, which is what's the nexus? So in government, we traditionally think about, okay, the relationships, this is foreign policy, so it's run by the State Department, and it's run by SRE, and it's run by Global Affairs. But the truth is, it is so much more than that in these relationships. There is not a cabinet agency in any of our 3 countries that doesn't deal with each other pretty much on a daily basis. And so it is a lot deeper than that. But for me also, and this is something where I think there's been a bit of debate lately, especially, is about the role of the executive and how important it is to have leadership and vision from our elected leaders, which are linked to democracy. How important that is in the relationship, and I've seen it over many different administrations in the US. It is absolutely critical to have the buy-in and the support of our leadership, in addition to the institutions, and to me, that's the critical link to democracy. Our elected leaders, and if we get them, when they come in with a vision and a plan for North America, there is so much we can do together, and I think that helps us propel us forward in prosperity and growth. And I think that's where the opportunity is to have a shared vision from the leadership all the way down into the day-to-day institutions. I think I've exceeded my time. I will stop there.
Thanks so much, Kim. Tony, your opening remarks.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to for the invitation, and to CSIS for the amazing partnership. As Kim mentioned, this North American trade partnership, the USMCA, is the largest free trade region in the world. And with this interdependency, presents opportunities and challenges, whether it's rule of origin, energy, as we have seen, labor, environmental, but also this interdependency requires us to look maybe beyond the trade lens, right? And Kim had alluded to some of this, sort of the democratic governance angle, which is rule of law, strong independent institutions, whether it's judiciary, electoral bodies, a robust civil society, robust independent journalists, independent political parties, a strong private sector that understands, right, the rules of the game, this predictability that's so important for economic prosperity. All these things are vital for the region to grow economically. But good governance and economic prosperity, they're not mutually exclusive. The U.S., Mexico, Canada, not perfect democracies. I mean, in my own country, the U.S., there's a lot of political polarization, which are really testing the strength of some of our institutions. Some of the things that at least we at IRI are looking at in terms of the Mexican context is a bit of kind of what we would call democratic deconsolidation, if you will. You have an executive that's very controlling of the narrative, that is very controlling of critics, whether it's civil society, whether it's journalists, have a hand in the electoral bodies that are supposed to be autonomous. There's not a lot of independence in the Supreme Court. You're seeing militarization, right, of society, of government, of development, which is what IRI works on. We're an international development implementing organization. So these kind of personalizations of these issues is concerning, and is concerning, we think, for kind of the economic viability of the North American market. I mean, can you imagine the figures that I've seen, maybe next year plus or minus 3% growth? Can you imagine what more could happen if democratic governance principles were more strengthened and were more at the heart of business? According to Latino Batrometo, a survey organization, 48% of respondents in 2021 believed in democracy. This is down from 61% in 2010. 13% view authoritarian governments as something that's needed. And where do you see that? You see that in Ecuador, in Paraguay, and in Mexico. This is concerning. So democracy has to work for everyone. We need to look at political parties and how they themselves internally can democratize to be able to get out and really listen to citizens. And I think this panel, democratic institutions as key pillars for economic prosperity, is extremely relevant. We'll talk a lot more about these issues. I think I'll leave it at that. That probably, again, surpassed my 3 minutes, but thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Thanks very much, Antonio. Antonio Dos, Antonio Ortiz, Mena, over to you for your opening remarks. What's the link between democracy and North America's economic vitality?
Thank you, Brian and CSIS for moderating. I'm a member of the board of the U.S.-Mexico Foundation, so I want to thank you for being here, and I want to encourage you to learn more about what we do and to support us. I had to do that. I strongly believe in our mission, right? Now, I originally come from academia, so I have this obsession with definitions, etc. So when we're talking about democracy, a minimalist definition would be a system of political representation in which political parties lose elections, not win, but lose elections, right? And I was just checking the Economist Intelligence Unit's latest report on the Democracy Index. In that index, we find that Canada is a full democracy. The US is a flawed democracy. The previous US president still refuses to acknowledge that he lost free and fair elections. So we have a democratic problem in the US, and Mexico was classified as a flawed democracy, but now is classified as a hybrid regime. So we have a problem, especially in the US and even more so in Canada, in terms of democracy. Now, what does this mean for prosperity? Again, I guess there have been many PhDs studying the relationship between democracy and economic development, but what I would posit, focusing on North America and the USMCA, are two basic ideas. For the production and investment in North America, what we need is rule of law, stable and predictable rules. So this would be like a minimalist, absolutely minimalist view of democracy. That's why Mexico negotiated the NAFTA a quarter century ago, because the president had nationalized the banks on a whim, and we needed checks and balances through an international agreement. Now, we have the USMCA that does the best it can to provide a stable set of rules, but democratic governance challenges, especially in Mexico, provide uncertainty. And certainly, there won't be a lot of trade and investment. That's on the production side. Now, on the consumption side, for consumers within the region and outside the region, I think that this minimalist definition, rule of law, won't cut it. Because consumers are increasingly concerned about labor conditions, about human rights, about environmental issues. So if there is not a North American view, or what we're calling the North American way, then we will have a big problem becoming the factory of the world. So for me, at least in this moment and in this region, democracy, of course, should be an end in and of itself. But if we don't get it right, I think we'll be missing a very big opportunity to foster investment and prosperity in the region.
Thank you very much, Antonio. Last but not least, Ana Paula, your thoughts on the link between democracy and economic prosperity.
Thank you, Ryan, and it's a pleasure to be here. Antonio, we were saying that because of COVID, seeing so many of you is really refreshing. We always say it's been ages since we last saw each other, but now it really is true. And so it's wonderful. Thank you to IRI and CSIS invitation, and to the US-Mexico Foundation, which sometimes Enrique is in my podcast talking about US-Mexico politics. So I really am thankful to the foundation. And to get to the subject. Democracy, we know, is in trouble worldwide. But the trouble that we are seeing now, I feel, is developing very differently from what we were used to seeing. It's not that suddenly there's a coup. So it's happening much faster, and it's happening in different timings and with different circumstances in each country, in each region. It's happening fast, and I think the epitome of this would be the elections in the United States. In 2016, Donald Trump lost the popular vote and only won the Electoral College vote. And that same night, Hillary Clinton called him to congratulate him on winning. 4 years later, Trump loses both the Electoral College and the popular vote, and he still does not recognize that he lost. And neither do many of the members of his party, the Republican Party, and I would say his party with a capital H. No? I was listening the other day to a podcast by NPR where Cody Keenan, Obama's speechwriter, was talking about a moment in June 2015, right after a shooting that occurred in the Mother Emanuel Church in South Carolina, where there was a Bible study. This is mainly black, one of the most important black churches in the United States. And a white man comes in and shoots and kills 9 people. So Obama tells his speechwriter, he's talking about this, Obama tells the speechwriter, I'm not going to go down there and give a eulogy. I am tired of this. I already have done it. I went to Newtown. I won't do this. Because after Newtown and giving a eulogy, I just saw a bunch of finger pointing, and then Washington went back to its own business. Things didn't change. But then Obama changed his mind because he saw in a live video feed how the families of the victims forgave the shooter. So he decided to go down there, and he gave a eulogy where he started by singing Amazing Grace. And in the podcast, I heard the president sing Amazing Grace, and I felt a pang of nostalgia, of thinking how not so long ago you could feel a politician feel what is happening in the country and act for the good of the country. This is not about being an Obama supporter, a Democrat, a Republican. It's not about politics. It's about how I see politicians in this moment, where I see much more greed, I see constant spirit of revenge, a lack of worrying for the country and the citizens that they should be representing, because it's more of a tribalism. I would like to further in that in a moment, but what I'm trying to say is that if leadership is lacking, and if everybody is polarized and trying and sees politics as a zero-sum game, then institutions which are formed by people, the democratic institutions, are failing us as well. And that's the point where I see we are now. I don't want to end with a pessimistic note this opening. I think that if history teaches us something, we can go and look at how Mexico or the United States was in the 70s. And I'm thinking maybe in Mexico, we call it the miracle years, the Milagro Mexicano, during the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. And at those times, we were seeing Mexico's economy as something very positive, buoyant. But those times were times of much less democracy in the country than we are seeing now. So this is just to say that I feel there are cycles. We are going through a cycle that needs a few corrections. And that is the greatest challenge we have at this moment.
Thank you, Ana Paula. So I want to jump right into some of the questions in the moderated portion of our discussion and jump right into some of the difficult issues after those opening remarks. And I want to come back to you, Kim, and discuss energy. Energy prices have put pressure on millions of consumers throughout North America, prompted an intensification of protectionist energy policies throughout the region. In Mexico, energy reform has long been a centerpiece of President López Obrador's platform, while in the U.S., we saw that the current administration was contemplating putting a halt on gas exports when prices were surging in the U.S. So why has energy proven such a flashpoint? What are the medium to long-term consequences of energy nationalism from an economic and democracy standpoint?
It's a great question. I guess I get the easy one of the panel. So I'll start and just say I want to echo something that you said, Ryan, which is And I think you hit it right on the head. This is an issue that affects everyone's lives. We are all impacted by it every day. We're about to have a midterm election in the United States, and political analysts who track voting intention look at gas prices. So I mean, it is something that is fundamentally political in all of our countries. And everywhere. And so I think that, that it affects people's lives. It is a real here and now, issue for all of us. I mean, we have to be able to charge our devices. So, and so I think at the end of the day, it is a very political issue, and that's why, all three of us, I would say, struggle with it to some extent. One of the things that really jumped out at me on the U.S. side is when President Biden took over. They always, presidents come in on their first day with a list of, to-do items that are their highest priority. And one of his highest priorities was canceling the permit for the Keystone Pipeline. And I think he did it on his first day in office. And I think that, our Canadian friends were displeased, I think, with that action. There was a discussion with the Prime Minister, but it was a decision that obviously the President took based on his view of what the correct decision was for the United States and his prioritization of climate policies and heading into energy transition. And so, I think you have these sovereign decisions, and as I always tell people, even sovereign decisions have consequences. So I think there will be some there, and I think, when we get into the situation with Mexico now, where obviously the trade agreement provided us a framework for to have a discussion about an issue that we don't agree on. And that's where we are now. USTR and the Canadian government have gotten together and asked Mexico to have consultations on energy policy. If the consultations don't achieve an agreement, I think folks know the process. They will open a panel, and the process will continue. But we have a structure for having that conversation. But the bottom line is, from a North American standpoint, we talk about all of us who've been doing this for a long time, and I'm sure everyone in this room. We want to see this region that we live in and that we share maximize its potential. We can't do that if we don't get energy right, because it underpins everything. If you're going to build, shift supply chains from a different part of the world to somewhere in North America, you must have cheap and abundant energy. And I'm sure many would prefer that cheap, abundant energy also be transitioning to be better for the environment. And so at the end of the day, if we don't get this right, I think we're going to have real difficulty in the coming years maximizing the potential of North America. And I will just close and say one thing in terms of our institutions and our effectiveness. We have got to find a way to make, and I worry about the polling that Tony was referring to, this erosion of support for democracy. I think people are doubting that our institutions work around the world, in the U.S. and all over the region, and it worries me a lot that there is a sense that our institutions no longer work. And I think part of it is we have to deliver. We have to deliver. We can't just have meetings and say, oh, we had a wonderful discussion about topic X. Well, if everything is not going well on topic X, people know that, and they wonder, what are institutions doing if they're not solving this problem? So I think we really need to think hard about how we conceptualize all of our interactions and how we make our institutions actually deliver for people, because that's the point. The point is to make people's lives better. And so how do we do that? And I think we need to be more effective. And this energy conversation that we're having among all three countries on issues in each of the three countries, I think is absolutely critical to that discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kim. I want to ask a question of Antonio Ortiz, and it follows, I think, from this question on energy. And it's, AMLO is not the only one to advance policy aims that have been having an effect on North American trade and integration. Early drafts of the recent U.S. Inflation Reduction Act offered tax credits to exclusively U.S.-made electric vehicles. Now, that was changed in a subsequent iteration of the piece of legislation, but nevertheless, I want to ask you, what are the dangers raised by such a tax on fundamental principles of economic cooperation? Antonio Ortiz.
Tony. Antonio.
Should we do Tony and Antonio?
I like Antonio too.
You like Antonio? Okay. I'll make sure I use last names then to ensure that
no, not at all.
Keeping the Antonio separate.
Yeah, so I think that has been a challenge in terms of the vision that the three North American countries had. Originally, Canada, the U.S. had a free trade agreement, then Mexico asked the US to negotiate a free trade agreement, and then Canada asked not to be left out. So I would say from the origins, from the NAFTA, there was no real North American vision. When USMCA was launched, that was quarter century after this experience with NAFTA, and I still see some tensions regarding a North American vision. For example, right now, it's not only the Inflation Reduction Act, but there's a dispute between Canada and Mexico on the one hand, and the US on the other hand, about how to define rules of origin for automobiles. So that, even though they negotiated a North American vision, there's still tensions within rules of origin for automobiles. In the US, there is a program called Made in America, not North America, but Made in America. So I see that there are a lot of tensions, and the electric vehicle provides opportunities. The Investment Reduction Act provides some challenges, but my sense is that we need to work together to be able to attract trade and investment caused by the geopolitical competition between China and the US, caused by the COVID pandemic and reshoring, and caused by what will probably be a long-term disruption from the Russian invasion of Ukraine on energy and on food. So we have la mesa puesta, the table is set, and we have to take a North American view. All governments are, facing domestic political pressures. There are midterms in the U.S. Mexico and the U.S. will have presidential elections in 2024. So I think it behooves civil society and businesses to have a North American view. One last thing I would say has to do with, I would call it something I could not achieve while I was the head of economic affairs at the Embassy of Mexico. I beseeched companies producing in the region to give me stories to explain why a regional supply chain was good for all three countries, not zero sum. And they were not able to do that because the lawyers would get concerned, because unions would get concerned. If we don't explain why this benefits everyone in the region, we won't take advantage of this.
Thank you, Antonio. I want to go to Antonio Garrastazu, particularly with some of those figures that you gave us in your opening remarks and that Kim picked up on in hers as well, on views of democracy in the region. And you highlighted views from Mexico that I find quite concerning, and I think many in the room probably find quite concerning as well. And the question is, as we enter the final third of the López Obrador sexenio, what are the key areas to watch, in your opinion, in terms of Mexico's democratic health? How can international partners effectively support democratic governance in Mexico with an eye to 2024 and beyond?
Yeah, thinking about Mexico's democratic health, I'm thinking about maybe 7 or 8 points. I'll go quickly through them. One is the Central Democratic Institution of the National Electoral Institute, right? The INE, that really back force that the administration is really hammering them, lowering their budgets, just using them as a scapegoat in the political discourse. INE, depending on what analysts you think about, is really the backbone of Mexico's democracy, right? They're not only a local force, but they're an international recognized electoral institution that observes elections, that trains globally. So they're one of the backbones of democracy. You have the militarization of society, of government, the independence of the Supreme Court, right? There's been some pushback from the administration. You're seeing, the president may be changing of the Supreme Court. There may be some vacancies for ministers, so this is concerning if it's filled in with, government folks that just say, yes, sir. You have, thinking about the 2023 elections in the state of Mexico and Coahuila, so you have the influence of narco politics in 2023 and 2024. One of the things that IRI is very concerned about, and some of the work that we're actually doing in country right now, is on anti-corruption. So we're also seeing kind of a pushback to the anti-corruption institutions, the national anti-corruption system. There's been a kind of a freeze, right, on a national executive secretariat. The Ministry of Public Administration, which is a key anti-corruption institution, is there's some proposals out there for for that organization to be in charge of both procurement and then kind of overseeing government spending. That is a concern. And then you're also seeing attacks right on the INAI, the National Institute for Transparency, Access to Information and Protection of Data. You're seeing attacks on civil society. In the Sol, right, which is a kind of main protector of civil society and civil society rights, has been eliminated. And then, of course, attacks on freedom of the press and journalists, which is quite concerning. So I think it's very important for international institutions to keep an eye on what's going on in Mexico. I think there should be support for civil society, including human rights groups, of course, journalists, be supportive of them and monitoring about what's going on, kind of as a check and balance. Work with the UNCA partners, right, to make sure that, not to be afraid to have these frank conversations as there has been for energy. I mean, you are supposed to be part of a team. Support the training of, federal and local judges. I think one of the most important is also supporting open government programs. As a great antidote to prevent corruption, I think the more information citizens have, the more powerful they can be. Support for the for the state, the national anti-corruption system, and also the state anti-corruption system. There's a lot of great examples out there, particularly for example, in Guanajuato, in the city of Leon, is a great state that's really focusing on these issues. And I think also maintain that pressure, and a lot of research I think needs to be done in terms of the influence of narco trafficking in politics, particularly in the state of Mexico, right? But I don't know the figures exactly, 7 to 8 narco trafficking organizations that are focused there. I think whoever wins the state of Mexico in 2023 has an eye on winning the presidency in 2024. And I think if the PRI, for example, which has been very strong in that state, doesn't win, I think they're done. So this is something I think should be really kept in mind and which should really be at the forefront of analysts. And of course, I think support for the independence of INE and other electoral institutions. I think that's fundamental. And we've seen what's been going on, for example, in the referendum that was held in April. The INE, I guess, from an outsider's view, doing the best they can. But of course, their budget was cut, so they didn't have as many voting centers as they could. So that was, an area where folks were criticizing it. So it's a non-win-win for them. But supporting that independence thing is critical for Mexico's economic prosperity and democratic consolidation, or more forward democratic thinking. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Antonio. If I could, if you'd permit me just a quick follow-up, because you're the director of Latin American and Caribbean at IRI. You do work in Mexico, and it's become other groups are making the same complaints and the same observations. It's become an increasingly difficult environment to work in, to do exactly the things that you just said need to be done, supporting civil society groups, anti-corruption groups, monitoring groups, and so forth. So is there a way in which IRI is thinking about how it can operate in Mexico to make sure that it's not in tomorrow's mañanera, or it's AMLO is not saying injerencia, and so forth, which has been done with plenty of civil society groups.
That's a great question. I mean, it's not an easy atmosphere to work, although IRI does work in very complicated and complex environments. So we have a certain approach of how we deal and how we work with countries. Our main focus here has been, at least now, working on anti-corruption and working with youth as kind of champions of anti-corruption, helping them create campaigns to advocate for transparency and accountability in their communities. What we do is we choose working with and trying to identify champions, right? Hence, we're working in the city of Leon with the mayor, who has been very, very open to work with us on open government initiatives in the state as well. We're working with youth and really helping to train them and to build their capacity to be what we like to call like agents of change. Now, it's a very difficult environment. We are very supportive, and I mean some of the international implementers that work on development and foreign policy, my colleagues at the National Democratic Institute, or IFIS, the Electoral Observation Organization in the United States. We are open supporters of the INE. We've participated since January in the INE's Electoral Democracy Summits, which just ended last week. We've been very open and vocal. We do not attack, nor will we attack, the government or anything like that. We try to work and, promote institutional building. Our partners have been getting it pretty hard, right? Particularly in some of the states where we work, which is Mexico City, Guanajuato, Coahuila, and Nuevo León. But we're there supporting, right? All we can do is work in places and in organizations and states where they welcome us. But it is very difficult. We try to do as much as we can. And yes, sometimes we are prevented from doing things where we think we can make a huge difference, particularly, working on some of these very sensitive areas, such as actively having a program to support the INE. That would not bode well, right, with the government. And of course, with our own government here, it's very difficult because they have to work, right? The embassy has to work with Mexico is an extremely important country. So it is difficult. So we do what we can and try to find those champions and partners to be able to do our work as best as possible, and really provide them with lessons learned and best practices so that they can kind of, have a viable voice in what's going on and have them be kind of those leaders.
Thank you, Antonio. Ana Paula, you said you wanted to develop this idea a little bit more from your opening remarks about some of the shared challenges that democratic health faces in North America. You mentioned polarization and some other things. So what are some of those common threats to democracy in North America? And I think, importantly, how can we work together in cooperating to respond to some of these challenges?
Well, I think both United States and Mexico face some challenges, and then I see another set of challenges that are faced by Canada included in this. If you read the book How Democracies Die by Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, they enlist three main characteristics of failing democracies. The first is that the head of state or the head of a party questions the electoral system and the electoral institution. And we just heard Tony talking about how the president in Mexico constantly attacks INE. They cut the budget for the institution. They decided to, and I spoke about this with Lorenzo Cordova, INE's president. They have a budget, and they constitutionally have to spend it in different ways. One is by doing all that has to be done to have an electoral credential, which works to go to the bank and works. It's your most important document, not only for voting, but to identify yourself. They have that. They have to look at how parties spend their money. They have to fiscalize the way that the parties spend their money. They had a amount of money that with which they had to do the referendum. So they have different ways of spending, and it's in the Constitution how they have to spend it. When they are cut their budget, they decided that they weren't going to do the referendum as it was supposed to be done, and decided to keep the budget unmoved in the other sectors. So I think that was a political decision that made INE confront the president and the president confront INE. But the thing is that the president is confronting the electoral system and the electoral institutions. And that is the first sign of how democracies die that Levitsky and Ziblatt see. Then they try to capture and those that represent checks and balances. The legislative branch, the judicial branch, any checks and balance on the executive, they try to capture it by placing people that are loyal to them, loyalists, or by cutting budgets, by different means. And the third way is by alienating or delegitimizing the opposition and the media. The opposition, they say, is illegitimate, or in the case of Mexico, the president says the opposition are the parties that have us in the situation that we are right now. They are to blame for all that is not working in the country, and that's plenty. That's the president's discourse. And to the media, the president calls them saying that they are captured by other interests or that they disseminate fake news. And we see all of this also in the US. I don't think I have to say much about how Trump did this, but that's how American democracy started to fail. So those are those are a set of things that I see in Mexico and in the United States. In Mexico, US, and Canada, I see a big challenge in social media and the effects it has in democracy, and social media and the spread of misinformation. Because yes, obviously misinformation works. If one Twitter user has 1,000 followers and shares a message, and only 1% of the followers share the message, then it will spread to 10,000 followers. And from there, those followers also will be spreading the information that is posted on the social network. So this represents a big opportunity and a big challenge. What we're seeing in Iran, for example, right now, when the government of Raisi is trying to say that they did not kill Masha, I forgot her last name, that they did not kill this woman while she was in custody of the moral police, then pictures are shown in media where you can see how she was bruised until she was left in a coma and then died in the hospital. So the positive side is that hiding information becomes much more harder when it spreads this way. But on the other side, you have the possibility of spreading fake news with much more speed and with a reach that no other medium has ever had before. So I see that as a very difficult challenge for all three countries. And I think how we can work together, Ryan, is difficult, but not impossible. We are seeing, for example, in social media, how governments are trying to find a way of making social media be less of a threat to democracy. And I think, for example, finding governments, finding experts to give courses or to first draft and then find the person to give courses in high school to students on the correct use of social media. By correct, I mean knowing how it works, because these are tools that are very powerful, and most of us use them with pretty much small knowledge of how algorithms work and how this misinformation is spread. So I feel that we have to prepare our younger citizens to know how to use these tools better in the future. So that would be probably a start. I mean, the other part we know, I didn't know IRI worked, how it works in Mexico. I know USAID works in Mexico, for example, because the president is constantly attacking USAID's work in Mexico. But at the end, USAID is still working to try to strengthen democracy and try to make the executive accountable. And as long as we are having this conflict, it means that we are trying to make things work. So those are ways that we can start to build upon making these democracies, institutions work better in all three countries.
Great, thank you, Ana Paula. Antonio Ortiz, I want to go to you. Yes, you. and ask a question about consultations by U.S. and Canada, which were initiated in July of this year. The U.S. and Canada moved forward with requesting dispute settlement consultations with Mexico under the USMCA process, which seems to be further fraying some of the consensus between member countries. So in your opinion, what needs to happen for these consultations to have a constructive instead of a disruptive influence on the North American community?
Yes, so there are consultations right now on between Canada and Mexico and the U.S. and Mexico regarding 4 main issues pertaining to Mexico's energy policies. One of them has to do with Pemex having extra time to comply with the production of low sulfur diesel. There are consultations about CRE, the Energy Regulatory Commission's delays and refusals regarding granting permits. There are consultations, or there were consultations regarding an obligation for companies to use gas from CFE. And the Supreme Court decided a few weeks ago that was unconstitutional, so now that's off the table. And that there are consultations about amendments to the electric power law, Ley de la Industria Eléctrica. So what needs to happen is to reach a negotiated solution about these 3 items that are left. I think that it is eminently possible to do it regarding the permits issue and regarding the low sulfur diesel from Pemex. Where I see more difficulties is regarding the Ley de la Industria Eléctrica, right? Because that would entail legal changes. So if consultations are not successful, then a panel would be established. Then a panel would determine whether Mexico is in violation or not of USMCA rules. And if it's found to be in violation, then you go back to negotiations. So Canada and Mexico and the US may have to negotiate again about what an acceptable solution is. So you could have like consultations and then a panel and then some negotiations after that. I believe that what Canada and the US are looking for is what I said at the outset: rule of law, legal certainty, not compensation, not maybe I'll do this or that, right? That's what our, speaking as a Mexican, what our trade partners want. And if Mexico's not forthcoming, then we could find ourselves in a situation where Canada could impose trade restrictions, the US could impose trade restrictions, and that creates a lot of uncertainty. When I was at the Mexican embassy, the US refused to comply with its commitments over cross-border trucking services, and we ended up imposing restrictions on US exports to Mexico. But that's not good, because that creates uncertainty. And if we are gonna do things the North American way, I think the North American way is rule of law and complying with our international commitments, what lawyers call pacta sunt servanda. You comply with your commitments. You don't start a food fight. So we have a lot of off-ramps, but I hope we don't go all the way before there's no off-ramp, okay? Let's hope reason prevails.
Okay, thank you, Antonio Ortiz. So last night, we had the opening of this conference. We had dinners that followed, and probably the conversation that was most ubiquitous in all of the separate rooms was about nearshoring. So Kim, I want to ask you a question about nearshoring. It was probably the nearshoring and ally shoring were the 2 words that I think I heard most frequently last night in all of the events. And it has become increasingly clear that authoritarian countries such as Russia and China are willing to hold companies and even economies hostage for political gain. And the result has been a push to relocate supply chains to countries with strong democratic institutions, what the U.S.-Mexico Foundation is calling ally shoring, what others are calling friend-shoring, and some are calling near-shoring if it's simply based on proximity. So give us your take on how can North America best take advantage of this moment?
That's a great question. But we were talking about the same thing. Everyone was talking about it. So, the first thing I will say is this. As I mentioned at the outset, I started my career working on North America with a group of business people 20 plus years ago. And I have never seen any opportunity greater than it is right now, today, for not only for Mexico and for the United States and Canada, but also for the rest of Latin America to attract the investment that I think is likely over the next few years to shift. If you look at polling and you look at CEOs and what they're thinking about, they're all thinking about their supply chains. And it was mentioned earlier, there are additional considerations that we've had COVID. There are some extraordinary stories coming out about what happened in the early days of COVID in the United States, that there was this sudden realization that we had a shortage of cotton swabs, and you needed cotton swabs in order to do the test. How can it be that the United States doesn't have enough cotton swabs, And so you begin to realize that we probably did something wrong here if we don't have masks and we don't have the what's called the PPE, all of the protective equipment that you need. So we had COVID. Then you have the geopolitical situation. This week was extraordinary. I mean, look at what is going on in the world this week. We had what appear to be explosions of a pipeline that happened 2 days ago. I can barely keep up with the news. This is a national security issue. If you ask a European right now about energy, they would say it's a national security issue. This is quite a moment for all of us to be thinking about what is the best way to go about protecting and ensuring our mutual prosperity. And so that's where you get to this nearshoring conversation, and the opportunities here are obvious. You can't really argue with geography. We share a land border. Why would you not nearshore to Mexico? We've been doing this now. All of our institutions where we started the conversation, we've had NAFTA in place and now USMCA. We've been trying to figure out how to do this better for 20 plus years, trying to make the border work better. How do we make it safe and fast? How do we do all these things at the same time? We've gotten pretty good at it, actually. So why wouldn't you? And the reason is, exactly what Antonio Ortiz said. Why wouldn't you? Because you have questions about the rule of law. What are the ground rules now if I make this investment, and how is that going to go? So I think those are the kinds of things that we certainly see that companies are thinking about. Where should I go? Where's the best place to go? Where is there a trade agreement? So I know that I have recourse if something goes wrong, that I have legal recourse and dispute mechanisms or consultations or various ways to try to resolve a situation. I have never, again, in my life seen the opportunity as great as I see it now. I will go as far as saying I do not think we are taking ourselves up on it. I think we are missing it right now, and it's all of us together who are doing it. I can put blame in lots of different places, but I would say this, having been in the relationship off and on for many years, different parts of government, we often lack ambition. And we end up in the day-to-day sort of firefighting because an issue comes up and we have to sort of deal with it, and we don't have this strategic vision. Ask someone, what should North America look like in 20 years? And you get a blank stare because it's just not, they're trying to figure out like what happened on Twitter 5 minutes ago, And so I think we're in a world where we need to stop and breathe and have some ambition about where we want to take this continent, in the next 2 decades, given that we now have 2 decades of experience in this, and the opportunity is extraordinary.
Thanks, Kim. If I can be permitted, and then I'll go to Ana Paula. If I can be permitted, just a quick follow-up with you, Kim. There were a lot of conversations last night that were following on from discussions about nearshoring, about how long such an opportunity would last. How big is the window? And I heard 2 years, I heard 5 years. I heard some people even saying positing it could be about 10 years. Do you have any thoughts, quick thoughts on how long this window of opportunity might last?
I think it's here to stay. I actually think it's going to be a little bit longer, and the reason for that is that one of the key drivers is this geopolitical shift with China, and a change in the approach to global affairs by the Chinese leadership, and a response, I think, by Washington, which is very, very bipartisan. We're not bipartisan on a whole lot in Washington these days, but the China issue is one area where there is a lot of consensus in Washington, D.C. So I think the opportunity, though, companies are going to make decisions. They have shareholders, they have quarterly earnings reports. Companies are living in a world where they have a different timeline. And so the question is, how quickly will those decisions be made, and how will the shifts occur? I think countries should not be thinking, that they have forever, but I think the shift is going to be a long-term strategic shift in how we do supply chains around the world.
Fantastic. Ana Paula, you had raised your hand. You want to weigh in real quickly?
I just wanted to pitch in a little bit. We have a saying in Mexico, Dios no le da alas a los alacranes. God does not give scorpions wings. And I feel that it applies perfectly to what is going on right now. If Mexico had a president that instead of thinking right now of building a train and of giving 3,000 pesos to each individual as the answer to inequality, poverty, and development, if we had a president that saw the opportunities that we have because of the geopolitical shift that China has brought in the relationships between Europe, United States, and Latin America, the country would be a whole different story, the region and the continent. But unfortunately, we're stuck with AMLO.
Thanks, Ana Paula. Antonio Garrastazu, I have a question about another potential domestic barrier in Mexico, and that is the armed forces. As we've seen under President AMLO, Mexico's armed forces have assumed a greater role, not just in public security, but in Mexico's economy, and especially through their state-owned enterprises. So in your opinion, how will greater military involvement in Mexico's economy impact the country's economic progress, democratic development, and what do high levels of military involvement in the economy signal for the future of democratic governance in Mexico?
Yeah, I think the militarization, and I had kind of alluded it a little bit earlier, is kind of one of the most contentious political issues, right now. I mean, just this week, the Senate was supposed to vote on a constitutional reform on keeping the military in the streets past 2024, I think through 2028. But the partnership or coalition, if you will, between the PRI and the Morena kind of broke down. And we were talking to some senators last night that it's being pushed back. There was talks that now AMLO may even have, not a referendum, but some sort of citizen survey sometime next year by the Ministry of Gobernación of the Interior to ask citizens what they think about the militarization. So this militarization of the civic space, right, is quite concerning. I mean, the military is involved in over 20 functions, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's social programs. They do have very high levels of trust among the population, right? That's a positive thing. But then they're also one of the ones that kind of score the worst on human rights, right? So that's kind of a red flag, right, on the democracy sphere, if you will. And militarization also carries a lot of risks, right? It encourages corruption and opacity, right, under the umbrella of national security. So that's something that is not good for economic prosperity. It doesn't bode well for democratic governance. I mean, you've also had an increase in the budget of the military. Some of the figures that I've heard is about $10 billion, so kind of the second highest budget within the country. They have a whole slew of tasks, whether it's the construction of the airport, the Tren Maya, the COVID vaccines, administration of the international airport, as you notice as you come into Mexico City, working on the delivery of free textbooks. Among all these things are not really functions of an armed force is really concerning. And some of the construction projects, such as the Tren Maya, are over budget overruns, right? So this is also affecting kind of the military as this great, exact, very orderly, disciplined organization, which can bring problems within the own institution, right? So this participation of the military kind of in as economic agents in the short or medium term, is very concerning. It's something that don't think it's sustainable or viable. The military has a function, is to defend the country. It's a national security, and with the national security comes so much responsibility. And what we're thinking is this kind of umbrella of national security also is being used to kind of pass things without any public debate, which is incredibly distracting, if you will, for democracy. And I don't think bodes well for the rule of law, the predictability that you need, right, for this kind of North American free trade region, which is so vital.
Thank you very much, Antonio. We have between 10 and 15 minutes for a question and answer session. We've got a packed house today. Thank you all very much for being with us. I think there's going to be a mic floating around at some point. Please make your question brief and make sure it's a question. So it's got a question mark punctuated at the end of a sentence. And I can direct questions to panelists once they're phrased. Yes, sir, in the middle. The gentleman who's, yep, there you go.
Thank you very much. Congratulations for your wonderful presentations. My name is Javier Gonzalez from the Mexican think tank Ethos. And I have a question for Ana Paula, because you mentioned the problem, the increasingly concerning problem of disinformation, misinformation, which, by the way, are different things. But we cannot get rid of disinformation entirely. You said that we should bring resilience and prepare the youth, and those things are perfectly fine. But what could be like the role of the big tech platforms, and of course the role of the government in regulating these platforms to prevent them to publishing, bad content and disinformation? Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, Ana.
Thank you. Yes, disinformation is your grandmother sending you a WhatsApp with something she saw. She doesn't know she's giving you incorrect information, but she still sends it to you, and probably you send it to the rest of your family. Misinformation is on purpose. It's the president in the morning press conference saying an outright lie, knowingly, but for political purposes. So yes, we see both things occurring. I don't know what exactly the Mexican government can do, because the biggest companies are not Mexican companies. Meta, it's Twitter, so those are not Mexican companies, and then they are private companies. And when the United States has faced such big companies that have so much power, the answer has been to split them apart. The telephone companies was one, railroad companies was another, and I think now the logic is different. And I believe what is happening, the discussion that is being had in the US, in Europe, of how to deal with these powerful companies is exactly trying to find out how you can fight this misinformation and disinformation. At this moment, I feel that we have had some leaks coming from inside the companies to show that they are not doing enough to try to do what is required of them, because they are so worried about having more users and being the top platform, that they are not willing to address what needs to be done. So I think this is not something at the moment that is in the hands, for example, of the Mexican government. But I guess that's the $1 million answer awaiting us as a society.
Fantastic. Okay. There's a hand in the center in the back. We have enough time for probably 2 more questions.
Hi, thank you so much for such a fantastic panel. I'm Guillermo Garcia. I'm an associate professor of law at Texas A&M University. We've heard constantly the term rule of law, right, and the importance of dispute resolution mechanisms attached to international treaties, and in particular in the USMCA. But it seems to me that what is happening in Mexico goes beyond the existence of these mechanisms, right? Because no company, and probably correct me if I'm wrong for all the business people, goes to a country wanting to litigate. That is not a business strategy. Your business strategy is to do business, and if you can avoid litigating, you'll try to avoid litigating. Can you share some of the best practices that you think that the companies are doing here to prevent having to raise any ISDS claims in international tribunals? Because I haven't seen, except for 2 or 3 filing for these announcements of disputes, most of the companies are working through their trade associations, right? They're pushing back in different mechanisms. So can you talk more about those mechanisms, especially for medium and smaller size companies?
I think this question would be really well positioned for Kim and also for Antonio Ortiz. So whoever, Antonio Ortiz, why don't you go first, and then Kim, if you don't mind.
Yes, you are right. There are less disputes than we might expect. And for those who are who do not read USMCA TOMEC every day. I assume that's everyone, unless you want to go to sleep. No? So there are state-to-state disputes, say US requesting consultations with Canada, and investor-state disputes. That's chapter 14, where a company asks the government for consultations, and if there's no agreement, there's a panel. So this is normal. In every trade agreement, they have dispute settlement mechanisms. My sense is that some companies are afraid to appear in las mañaneras, like Iberdrola, right? If under my rights, it is my right, I say the government is violating my rights, then the government will say I'm imperialistic and I'm exploiting Mexican workers and I'm corrupt, and that's a big deal. So there is, honestly, a certain fright about appearing in la mañanera. And I don't think working through trade associations is resolving issues, and I don't think that companies want compensation. Companies are investing here not to litigate and get some money. They're investing here to create jobs and generate profits, right? So I don't think this is a sustainable strategy. They're going, as it was the situation, case by case, compañía por compañía. The US government tried that did not produce results. That's what we have consultations. And I think that at some point, companies could lose patience. And instead of fighting, they exit. Yeah? Okay, so I'll vote with my feet. So I'm concerned about that. I think that the mechanisms are there at the USMCA, but we assume that countries will abide by their agreements. And the USMCA is not powerful enough to do that. So I'm very, very, very concerned about the rule of law in Mexico. And I think that is one of the Achilles heel, together with energy, which is related to lack of rule of law in Mexico, that will help us attract investment or lose this huge opportunity. Sorry to end on that. It's unrealistic.
Kim, do you have anything?
Note.
Kim, do you have anything to add? Maybe perhaps more positively, although maybe not.
On the upside, just a couple of comments. I guess a couple of things, and if you're really, really having difficulty sleeping, I published an article about 6 months ago on diplomacy and corporate government affairs in Latin America, and the similarities between what I used to do in government.
Probably only one download of that article.
Yeah, what I used to do in government and what a lot of companies do in their government affairs when they're working overseas. And I will tell you, we deal with a lot of clients every day that are having difficulties. And the truth is, the best way to deal with them is to prevent it from getting out of hand in the first place. And what that often means is having a really good local team, making sure if your headquarters is not in Mexico, it's somewhere else, that you have a lot of fluid communication between your local team and your headquarters that really lays out any risks that you might see to your business. And then if you end up in a difficulty, the other thing I see a lot is that having those relationships on the ground wherever you operate is really important with your local government, with your state, municipal, and also federal relationships. And one thing that is always surprising to me is the number of really significant companies that invest overseas, but the kind of government affairs piece sort of comes after, and to me that piece is really, really central to being successful anywhere, in any market overseas. So I think there's a lot of things you can do proactively. And then when you end up, in a really serious dispute, you have the treaty protections, you have all of your domestic legal recourse, which people use, and so you have all of your legal options as well, sort of in the toolkit. But I would certainly advise, have a good corporate government affairs team on the ground that tries to prevent the dispute from getting to that point.
Thank you, Kim. And as someone who has read that article, I would recommend that those in the audience go and grab it.
It's in the Inter-American Law Review.
It's a very, very good article, very scholarly. We have about 2 minutes left, so I'm going to say there's enough time for one question, but it's got to be a lightning round. So I saw a hand go up in the middle, towards the front here.
Yes, thank you. I'm Benjamin Castro. I'm representing Baja California state government in this event. I'm just wondering. There's a big shadow right now, that's China, right? The big shadow behind the North American way, or the new North American way, is China. And also the new light is this concept of ally shoring or nearshoring. So my question is, to what extent is Mexico able to actually successfully replace Chinese companies in American and Canadian supply chains? We hear that that's a big opportunity, but to what extent can we actually seize that opportunity?
Fantastic. I'm going to do maybe 15, 20 seconds each, and I'll start here with Kim, and we'll just go down the panel so that you all have a chance at a last word, but very quickly.
Just really quick, I think we've said it, but I would say, you've got to have a level playing field for foreign investors. If there's a sense that local companies are going to get preference, whether it's in energy or any other sector, the playing field's not level, and if you don't have that level playing field, it's just not going to be an investment destination. The other is education, and I think we've come a long way in North America on education, and Mexico produces a lot of engineers. We're pretty good at some things, but we need to keep modernizing our education system so that we have the people to drive these investments and create the prosperity that we've all been talking about.
Thank you very much. Antonio Garrastazu?
In terms of China, I think you have to look at the Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, opacity is really bad for business. Doing business with China, you really don't know what's in those contracts. Just take a look at what happened with Ecuador and the strangled government debts that they had to restructure. So it's really getting out there that civic education, that education in general, that really doing business kind of behind the scenes, if you will, is just not good. It's not good for prosperity.
Thanks very much, Antonio Garrastazu. Ana Paula?
Well, I would say, how far can Mexico cover this geopolitical shift as far as the government is willing to let businesses do it? I think we do have the capacity, but right now the break comes from the government.
And finally, Antonio Ortiz.
Yes, so I would say it's not necessarily substituting Chinese companies because there's a lot of Chinese investment. So it's a more complicated situation, but in addition to the rule of law, I would focus on two things. Number one, energy. I know that there are some challenges in Baja California providing energy to companies that want to produce there. And secondly, infrastructure and logistics. If we don't have that, we're not the U.S. neighbor. We might as well be far away, but I think Baja California is pretty close, so we have a big opportunity.
Thank you so much to our panelists. I promised at our outset that we would have a superlative panel. I think we've delivered that. It's been a real tour de force on the linkages between democratic institutions and the economic vitality of North America. Thank you to Kim Breier, Antonio Garrastazu, Ana Paula Ordorica, and Antonio Ortiz Mena. Thank you very, very much as well to our audience for being here.